so many of the times that we talk about the rest of the world, we listen to the stories from a very narrow group of people. If we are just listening to the rest of the world through this American gaze or through people who know what we want to hear, I think that we're doomed. For the next 10 years, we cannot just be listening to a kind of media landscape that is just suffused with an American point of view. It's not the way in which we're going to understand crisis. It's not the way we're going to understand the tectonic shifts. And so who are local voices who have a story to tell, but who just need some partnership in order to be able to catch the ear of Americans?
Welcome to the Work for Humans podcast. This is Dart Lindsley. As an international correspondent for NPR, Gregory Warner has lived and worked in some very high conflict zones: Afghanistan, Ukraine, and Rwanda. Through his travels, he found his true passion, which is using narrative forms and local stories to make the least heard voices and perspectives on the planet heard. This led him to launch NPR's show, Rough Translation, named one of New York Times' top 10 podcasts of 2021. Last season, he ran a series of surprising stories about workplaces and work cultures around the world. In this episode, Greg and I discuss why young people in China love a slacker hero, why some South Korean companies are promoting the use of American nicknames at work, the risk of failing fast in Lagos, and in general, we talk about how work practices in every country emerge from crisis, family dynamics, and sometimes by government fiat, as well as much more. All right, if you enjoy Work for Humans and you want to show your support, please consider subscribing wherever you listen to podcasts. And now, my conversation with Gregory Warner. Gregory Warner, welcome to Work for Humans.
Thank you so much, Dart. Very excited to be here.
I'm very excited to talk to you. First of all, I'll just tell you, anybody who works for NPR, to me, is a celebrity. So anybody I would talk to at NPR, I would just sort of like be just a little bit starstruck because it's got such a great brand and it's such, my kids grew up with it and it's just NPR's got such a great brand. But your work in particular has been very interesting to me because if I'm going to frame it, I'd say your show, Rough Translation, goes around the world looking at different issues from the perspective of different parts of the world. And you did a whole season, I guess, on work. And I really want to look at work from around the world. So is that a good characterization of Rough Translation?
Yeah, no, it is. I'll just say, before I started Rough Translation, I had spent about a decade traveling the world as an international correspondent, telling stories from different parts of the world. I'd lived in Afghanistan, lived in Ukraine, Rwanda. Most recently, or just before the show, I was the East Africa correspondent for NPR, based in Nairobi. And I think what I was struck by at that time was all these places were modernizing, whatever modernizing quite meant. Even that it was easier to communicate internationally. We could cross the ocean with a single click. It didn't make it any easier to understand each other. And so the premise of the show, the initial impetus of the show was, it's one thing to understand the words, but it's another to understand where people are coming from. And so, yes, I've always struggled with explaining exactly what we're doing because it sometimes feels inventing it with each episode. But basically, with each episode, we are trying to unpack some kind of cultural rule or social norm around the world. But as you said, through the perspective of someone struggling or wrestling with that cultural rule or social norm. And that second part is really important because if folks have not heard the show, it's a very narrative show. We use a lot of tools of screenwriting and fiction. We're telling stories about people that you're going to get to know. We may know about their childhoods. We may know what makes them tick. You're going to walk in their shoes. And then often we're choosing characters who are outside the United States. Sometimes there's exceptions to that, but that's mainly our focus. And the reason is we want to give people who are listening something akin to a kind of meaningful travel experience. So the same way that travel can be, good travel, really memorable travel can be disorienting, and you can have that feeling of, oh my God, the world is bigger than I thought it was. We want to go on a journey with somebody who's going to give us a new perspective on ourselves and help us see home a little differently.
I got to say, total success. It puts you in a position, and in the case of most of what I listen to, it puts you in a position to look at work that I had to stand far away in the shoes of somebody who you were reporting on to actually see my own work and see it differently. So first of all, your process is interesting to me, which is how do you even identify, I think there's a story here? And the reason I bring it up is that the world is so big. The lens that you just described is such a big lens and could apply to so many things. The question is, when do you know there's a thread?
It's absolutely true. In some sense, the world is a terrible beat to have. As a journalist, I always found that a beat is a very focusing thing. I've had the economics of healthcare beat in my past. I've had the East Africa beat. It's a very focusing thing. I think it's important to understand what is our beat. And sometimes I've thought of it as the 18th bureau of NPR. It's a kind of a understanding globalization beat, but it's not even just that. I think that when I find stories, I think about certain kinds of filters by which I evaluate a story and whether it'll work. And I ask certain questions of the story. So one question I try to ask is, well, since a lot of times we're telling a story about somebody going on a journey and discovering something, was anything different than what you expected? And it's funny because a lot of times journalism is structured, a lot of journalism is done kind of quickly, but it's structured as, oh, I went to place X and I found the thing I expected to find. And here I am, but I was there and I report on it and I'm telling you about it. That can be useful in the world, but it's not going to be a memorable or disorienting travel experience. So we're looking for the things that didn't fit your assumptions going in. Similar question I will ask is, well, what about this story is hard to explain to an audience that's not from there? The very first episode we ever did was out of Brazil. I was speaking to the outgoing Brazil correspondent, Lulu Garcia Navarro, and I asked her, what in 3 years of covering Brazil have you not been able to explain to American audiences? And she says, I've done dozens of stories about race. I still don't think I've explained it. So the Brazilian idea of race to Americans, and it is so different. And so that's a place I love to be. I mean, if we're going to spend 30, 40 minutes of your time, we're definitely going to try to tackle something that's hard to explain. And then, as I mentioned, I do think a lot about the tools of fiction and screenwriting. My wife is a novelist. She's a collaborative partner in everything I do. And so I try to think, what's the clash of values in this story, where a character wants one thing, but also secretly desires another. Well, you see this in movies all the time, right? A character feels a duty to go to war, but also a duty to stay home and support their family. They want to be independent, but they want companionship. They want to, they have a systemic approach to and understanding life, but they worry about the inhumanness of systems design. And so they seek humanity in systems. I mean, there's clashes of values in all of the work we do, the best work we do. And so I think it's helpful to watch those value clashes happening. It's the sort of ingredients of empathy if we see somebody struggling between values. And so the interview process is so important to what I'm doing. Oftentimes we'll throw out a great story because we just don't have the access to hear from the person in the right way.
I'd love to take as an example your episode about China. And I can't remember what it was called.
A Song for the Exhausted.
Right. And I want to take it as an example for two reasons. One is it's such a great story. And the second reason is the window it opens up onto work from another part of the world. When did you first know that was a story? And if you could walk us through its development.
Sure. I think this one started with a conversation a year back with our Beijing correspondent, Emily Fang. She had sent me an email. I think the email was called Russian Guy Trapped in a Game Show in China. And let me just say, that has nothing to do with the story we end up doing. This is, if you wanted the evolution, I'll tell you.
That's the way discovery happens. It's like, oh, there's a thread. Let's follow it.
That was exactly it. So it was a conversation about this particular Chinese game show, which is, as far as I remember, I don't remember the name of the show, but it was some kind of boy band contest where, you had to show that you could sing well enough and dance well enough and smile hard enough to be the final contestants. You get voted off the island type of thing. The final contestants would get to join this new boy band that would be, that would tour. And so everybody is singing and dancing their heart out. And there's this one contestant who is not even phoning it in. He is doing worse than phoning it in. He's not singing on key. He's hardly dancing. He's not smiling. And he should be voted off. But round after round, he is not. And the audience is keeping him on. And he's sort of a slacker hero. And so I said to her, well, maybe this is people just making mischief on the internet, messing with reality show rules because, they can. She said, no. If you understand China, this is an expression of discontent in a very rare forum to express discontent. That's the first I can remember talking about this idea of in a country that is so focused on productivity and work and, beating the US in productivity and uplifting millions of people out of poverty. All of those national messages are going on, but slackerdom has this base of support, this secret base of support. So this was this initial seed of an idea. That guy who was on the game show wouldn't talk to us, so we tabled that. I said, next time you meet a slacker hero, give me a call. And then she did about 8 months later. So 8 months later, she told us that she had just attended a rock show. And in this rock show, people were sleeping while watching the rock show. So just before the show came on, there were chairs set up with pillows. People could take a nap. They were so exhausted. They were sleeping just before the show. And then when the show started, the rock identity of this main singer, this lead singer, was so counter to the kind of rock idea that you might expect. He was saying he was called Manager Chen because he's a bank manager in real life. He was making the drudgery of work a kind of badge of honor, and people would say, "Oh, you're 30 years old. You look 50." And the way in which people were engaging as fans was this shared suffering about the exhaustion that everybody here felt, and that was what was bringing people together. And so, a story about a slacker hero and a story about the community that's created in these rare pockets in China around the drudgery of work became the seeds of the story.
On this show, we've been exploring the principles of multi-sided management, which is the belief that work is a product that every company builds and delivers to employees. This struck a nerve. Work for Humans is in the top 5% of podcasts worldwide. And along the way, people began to approach us, asking us how they could put multi-sided management into practice. And they were from all walks of business, line managers and CEOs, 3-person startups and multinationals and universities. But they all shared in common the belief that management practices of the last century are clearly not working. In response to this demand, I've pulled together a small team of some of the best people I have ever had the privilege to work with during my long career, who are also passionate about multi-sided management. And we formed a company 11-fold to serve the need. If you want your employees to feel more alive at work, you want happier teams, lower turnover, and you want tools that traditional management failed to give you to balance the needs of the company and the needs of your teams, let's talk. Employees give your company value it cannot survive without. When you fail to design great work, they will unsubscribe, either by leaving or even worse, by losing the ability to care. Join us at 11fold.com, spelled 11FOLD. Let's change management. It's interesting. I try to think of slacker heroes in the United States. The Big Lebowski comes to mind.
Yes.
He's like a slacker hero, but not the kind of cultural phenomenon that you found with the scooter thief. Can you describe the scooter thief and just what he said? Because what he said that made him a meme seems so anonymous to me.
Absolutely. His name is Zhou Liqi, and he'd had a tough life growing up. As we found out later, he had a third grade education, was raised, did day labor work, was very poor growing up, and had been arrested a couple of times for various petty thefts. And one day he was being arrested for stealing scooters, and a local TV news crew happened to film him in the police station, handcuffed. And they said to him this question, and this question would become famous throughout China. They said to him, "Why don't you just get a job?" And he said, "Working in this life is impossible for me." And when he said that phrase became, to call it viral is an understatement, because it would become the mantra for so many people who saw this as a very important thing to say in China at that moment. And so this guy kind of looks like Che Guevara in some ways. He has the dark, brooding good look. So his face was plastered on mugs and memes and T-shirts. He was called Che Guevara, which means the thief Che Guevara. When he got out of prison, he was offered all these lucrative influencer deals. And imagine this, you get out of prison for stealing a scooter. You have no idea what's happening outside you. And then you get out of prison and you're a hero to all these people. But not only was he a hero, he was also a threat to the Chinese government, which saw him very much as encouraging a kind of slacking off that they did not want to encourage. And then the story is really about how Zhou Liqi is going to navigate his popularity, but also his notoriety.
And this actually shows up in a lot of the episodes, which is this stitching together of a story about work and then the government's position on that part of work. I saw it there was one episode about lunch must be eaten out in France. It is a law that you must eat lunch out. This is one of your episodes. And so it connected up into government. And there was another story that was about Portugal that was, again, connected up into the fascist history of Portugal. So things that are happening in work, they do connect up into the country and into the government and what the government wants, which was super interesting. And then there was this middle layer, which was, I'm going to call the sort of the cultural layer, which is in most of the stories. And let's kind of track that. So the government saw this cultural hero, this sort of Robin Hood of slackerdom, as a threat to their economy, to their future. And then you wove through it a story, which was the story of a teacher who was learning about this slacker from her students and this slacker hero and realized that it was her story. So what was her narrative?
Yeah, thanks for noticing that because, in some sense, Zhou Liqi is the easier story to tell. He's a meme and we follow his journey. But just as important, I think, to this kind of storytelling is finding the ordinary person in the society, maybe the person who may completely agree with this cultural rule, but then comes to question it. And she's just as important as to understand, because she gives us that local perspective. So we really can see this cultural change through the eyes of somebody in China. So this woman, her name is Eris. We only used her first name for security. And she's a teacher who initially grows up thinking, okay, the key is just work as hard as you can. The early bird catches the worm, she says. And she becomes less and less satisfied in her work. And then she wants to do something which would seem to be completely normal. She wants to leave teaching and go to law school. And she's 25. So perfectly lateral, reasonable career moment. It's a terrifying experience for her because that means if she's going to leave teaching and go to law school, she's going to be the oldest person in law school. Nobody changes careers, she says, at that age, that old age. But also, most importantly, she's going to disappoint her family. One of the dynamics that we explore in the story is not just the Chinese state and its focus on having as productive workers as possible, but also the way in which quitting your job can feel like quitting your family, quitting your responsibility. These are often kids who've been, they're in the one-child policy generation. So they may be the only child of their parents, and their parents have invested a tremendous amount of money in them. They're also doing way better economically. They have more opportunities than their parents, but that puts a tremendous amount of pressure on them to be the earner and to not make the wrong choice. And this was a period where we were talking a lot about quiet quitting and the Great Resignation. And I was very interested that even though the same dynamics were there in China to have a Great Resignation, you did not see quitting in such numbers.
And this is when I knew was having sort of a cultural moment in that. It happened more than once in that particular episode, which was, I'm going to disappoint my family by becoming a lawyer.
Yeah.
That's when I knew that I was standing on the other side of another planet or something. Is sort of like, was that moment. I mean, I can comprehend the slacker hero, but I'm still sort of beyond comprehension in why becoming a lawyer is so disappointing.
Yeah, I don't have an easy answer for it, but I would just say that it's about changing your mind.
But also that her pathway to that was a slacker. So here's somebody who can question work at the most fundamental level. I cannot work in this world, in this life. I can't work. That opened a door to her to say, is this the work that I want to do? And actually stand back from it because it broke every assumption for her. And then she was able to actually start to see a way into a different career. And I think did she lie about it to her parents? I can't remember. I had this feeling like she felt she had to hide this from her parents.
Yeah, she hid it for a while. And then the the school, in a kind of paternalistic move, alerted her parents.
And also, this was something that recurred as a theme, I thought, through the different episodes, which was government and parents having a sort of cultural alignment.
Right.
And so I heard this in the story about Portugal. And just to recap that one, it's a woman who went to work in Portugal. Once upon a time, and I did not know this, Portugal was under a fascist government for a long time, and they saw work as an extension of the arm of their government. And so authoritarianism was baked into the work culture of the country, and it had affected her father. What was her relationship to work and her father and the government? How did that tie together? And now we're talking about the Portugal story.
Yeah. So this is, I think the title of this one is When Your Country's Brand is Escape, But You Can't. And just to put a headline on this, I will say that the point you made about government is so crucial, and I really want to talk about it because the way in which government and family are interwoven has made me think about, I know a phrase that you use a lot because I've become such a fan of your show, is this idea of treating our employees as customers. But I hear in the echoes of these stories is treating your employees as citizens. The way in which the values we're expected to demonstrate as citizens, duty, loyalty, maybe some level and implicit idea of sacrifice, are then echoed in the workplace. So just kind of throw that out there as a possible sort of theme throughout this. But let me just quickly tell the story.
Super interesting thread. I'm going to come back to it.
Oh, good. So, okay, the origin of this was quite interesting. So basically, we heard about this law in Portugal, which made it illegal to contact your employees after work. So it would be up to a $10,000 fine if you were to send an email or contact your employee after work. Tend to be people hear that and think, hey, that sounds great. I'd love to live in a place like that, which, as we explore in the story, is really kind of the very goal of the law. The law is a very strategic move by a country that's very focused on its brand identity. And as we talked we chose a reporter who had covered this. And one of the things that's very important to us is having these conversations with a local reporter and understanding what they think about the story. And this reporter had covered this before, but had just, for other outlets, just fed the quotes to the editor who wrote the story. I said, well, what do you think about this story? She said, please don't do the story that everybody's doing. Please tell the truth about this law. And let me tell you what it's like to work in Portugal. And she started revealing this story of really some very abusive workplace practices. And in the workplace, she was expected to work all the time, work many hours, constantly humiliated, mistreated, expected to toady up to the boss at all moments, but really extreme versions of this. And what was most painful for her was that her father, who had always taught her to be as independent as possible, suddenly, for some reason, when she would come back and say, oh, I was treated this way at work and this way at work, and I stood up to the boss, he would say, don't do that. He got small and he got scared, and he'd said, please don't stand up to your boss in this way. I think that there's so much truth in there in terms of our culture of work and the way in which we relate to work is learned at family. And she was struggling with why her family, her father, who she looked up to, was not supporting her when it came to her experience at work. And so then we explored that, and it really has to do with her father's upbringing in the wake of the dictatorship that had ruled Portugal for such a long time. Antonio de Oliveira Salazar, he was one of the big four with Franco, Stalin, Hitler. And his dictatorship had absolutely enforced a kind of idea that work is the way in which you express your loyalty to the state. And every company's loyal to the state, every worker is loyal to the company. And those ideas of loyalty had informed her father's upbringing and tactics of humiliation, which he had learned even in law school. So this idea that you prepare for work like you're preparing for war was something that her father had learned and was unfortunately passing on to her. I will say that one of the powerful things about doing a story like this is the reporter had no idea all of this stuff was going on. This was all something deeply buried. And she's written me so many emails since then saying everything since doing the story has been different for her and her father. So it was a cathartic experience to untether herself from this historical trauma that she didn't even realize was in there.
It felt that way. It felt like I could feel her discovery through this. And it relates to a couple of different things. One is somebody who's going to be on the show, who's an episode that's coming up, is Bob Aubrey, and he's somebody who's essentially establishing the practice, the educational practice of what is HR in ASEAN. And his approach is, it's almost like a human rights approach to employment, but more than that, people are a national resource to ASEAN that needs to be nurtured. And so he's looking at it from a more of a human development perspective, but almost like the World Bank might look at it, which is let's raise the practice of HR to be something that's about growing the economy as a development opportunity. Portugal, cause and effect was not clear to me there. Was work fascist or, authoritarian and cruel because the government had been fascist for so long, or had there been a fascist government because culturally that was an acceptable narrative?
Well, let me pick up on something about the development point, which is interesting. One thing that I found very useful to think about in doing these series and these stories was purpose in terms of why we work. That was one of the reasons I think we tried not to have it just be white-collar digital workers around the world. We wanted to explore other kinds of forms of work. I wish we had done more of that, but we wanted to understand what is the meaning that people seek in work. And we usually frame that positively. I seek it community, I seek value, I seek a sense of authority. But there's also ways in which work can be a place where we replay things in our own lives. And when we see, for instance, the China story is a good example of that. When people feel that being publicly tired is important to show. It's important to show that you're so exhausted that you'll fall asleep on the subway because you're working so hard. And in Portugal, it's important to show that you are absolutely devoted to the core, the common mission. Those are negative senses of purpose, but they are just as ingrained. It is interesting. I've done a lot of reporting on international aid and the dangers of international aid. And oftentimes we expect that people are driven by the universal things, that we are all human beings. But there's so much culture that determines what causes human action. I think that the value of these kinds of experiments and these kinds of interviews is really taking the time to understand, well, what drives people? Why do they go to work?
Yeah. And which is of course what I'm so interested in. I'm interested in what people are getting from work. And in fact, one of the things that people answer the question, what job do you hire your job to do for you? They answer it, I hire my job to pay my debts. And the first time somebody said that to me, I said, you mean like your student debts? And they said, no, the debt to my family who got me here. And so very much like the teacher that you reported on in China, this idea that I have a debt to family. There was another sort of pattern I saw throughout all of these stories, and which is that the United States is, maybe particularly Silicon Valley, is exporting ideas of what work should be or could be. And so in East Africa, you reported on people who were looking at failing fast, and that means something different. It doesn't just export and make sense necessarily. But there was another place, and I want to talk about this one first, which was first American nicknames in Korea. That one blew my mind.
Yeah.
So when did you find that story, and what did you find there? On this show, we've been exploring the principles of multi-sided management, which is the belief that work is a product that every company builds and delivers to employees. This struck a nerve. Work for Humans is in the top 5% of podcasts worldwide. And along the way, people began to approach us, asking us how they could put multi-sided management into practice. And they were from all walks of business, line managers and CEOs, 3-person startups and multinationals and universities. But they all shared in common the belief that management practices of the last century are clearly not working. In response to this demand, I've pulled together a small team of some of the best people I have ever had the privilege to work with during my long career, who are also passionate about multi-sided management. And we formed a company 11-fold to serve the need. If you want your employees to feel more alive at work. You want happier teams, lower turnover, and you want tools that traditional management failed to give you to balance the needs of the company and the needs of your teams. Let's talk. Employees give your company value it cannot survive without. When you fail to design great work, they will unsubscribe, either by leaving or even worse, by losing the ability to care. Join us at 11fold.com, spelled 11FOLD. Let's change management.
So this started with a conversation with a reporter in the Seoul bureau in South Korea. And I was asking her, what are you seeing interesting trends around work? And this, I think, was at the end of the list. She just said, more and more startup companies are using American nicknames. The idea is that instead of being introduced to your coworkers with your Korean name, you'll choose an American nickname. And that's part of the onboarding process. You'll say, okay, I'm going to be Betty. I'm going to be Alex. And then that becomes your name and only a first name. And usually it's got to be an English nickname. So why? Well, I think a lot of people have written about the formality, the hierarchy in South Korean businesses, in South Korean work culture. Malcolm Gladwell has written really compellingly about this, the disaster at the airline, Korean Airlines, where people were not empowered to speak up, to talk to their supervisor and question what they were doing. And of course, startups, especially tech companies, especially thrive on a flat culture. So how do you import a flat culture into a place which is very hierarchical and very formal, even down to the greetings? And we talked to this one company that tried so many different experiments. I mean, every possible experiment you might think of in terms of flattening the culture. And finally, they resorted to this strategy. They said, there's too much baked into greetings and names. There's so much loaded age, title, seniority, rank. It's all baked in to just the way we say hello and the way we're constantly interacting with each other. So let's just be Alex's, let's just be Betty's, let's be Elizabeth's, and we'll strip that away. I was like, this is totally not going to work. Like, how is it going to work to paper over centuries of hierarchy just because you're going to call me Greg instead of, Mr.
It would be director, senior director, Greg.
Yeah, well, one day I'll be senior director. You're the higher title one.
So I did Taekwondo for years, and you called the master instructor Sunbae-nim, and it means, and actually eventually Kwanjanim, which means ninth dan or something like that. It is baked into the addresses.
It's interesting. The way we usually talk about culture, especially in a business context, tends to be a bit static. So we'll say South Korea has a more hierarchical, formal culture, or in Brazil, do a lot of small talk before you start talking about business, or any number of cultural rules like that. It's not that these things aren't true. That's not really how people interact, especially with their own cultures, especially young people. And so I find it interesting to find a kind of sideways way into culture. And oftentimes bilingual people have an interesting sort of half in, half out way of seeing the culture that's really more true to the dynamic way culture exists in our lives. So for example, the reporter of that story, she speaks fluent Korean, is also English. And she said to me, there's this funny thing when she starts a conversation with a source and they start in Korean, then the kind of hierarchy asserts itself. So if she's speaking to is older or has some more seniority, then suddenly she doesn't feel empowered to ask certain questions and she has to get over that. But if she starts in English, then even if they switch to Korean later, it's kind of smooth, it's become more equal. And I found that so surprising because well, first of all, it tells us that language is so important, but it also tells us that culture is improvised in the moment and the rules can be shifted by something seemingly so small. I love finding out ways not only people navigate culture, but way people sort of hijack it and get around it in surprising ways.
Yeah, there's a way in which the world is emerging from a period in which local meant local. I've sat around tables in, probably the best example was in Belgium, where every single person at the table was speaking 3 languages. Every single person. There were 20 people at the table, and they were all communicating in 3 languages. And they were all international citizens of one brand or another. It was incredible and completely merged. And so, yeah, I think that's important to sort of recognize that the fluidity of it, that it's not static, and that it's coming into being all the time.
Somebody said to me when I was based in Nairobi, they said a 19-year-old Kenyan has more in common with a 19-year-old American than they do with a 42-year-old Kenyan.
Yeah.
The internet and the globalization, global culture, that is such a factor. And it's also why it's very difficult to think of it in a static way, because people are constantly switching back and forth. And yet it doesn't mean that local culture isn't just as important and just as powerful. It's just not so easy to pinpoint. And so that's why I think these personal stories just help sometimes remind us about, it's like the difference between a case study that sort of outlines everything in clear bullet points and a story, which is emotional and messy, but somehow feels more like what it's really like to live in the world.
You know what else comes up to me in those stories is that this idea that Silicon Valley in particular is exporting ideas about what work should be. Silicon Valley's lying, but enough people believe it. You know what it reminds me of a little bit of? It reminds me of Flower Power in the 60s, which was Flower Power was as I understand it, was a media event. It was an idea that was being sold, and it brought all these young hippies into the cities with peace and love, and they were just absolutely victimized by thugs because Flower Power was not really true. And so, on the other hand, it can have real benefits, which is the idea of exporting first names. It is true that there is much less, I believe, that there's less hierarchy. And one of the things that you had pointed out, or that came out in one of your episodes, is once people took on those names, they became different people.
Yeah, this was not something I expected. Yeah, that being, that turning from Hieji, which is one of the characters, to Hannah, as Hannah, she just felt absolutely empowered to say, no, I can't do this work and give it back to the boss if it was done incorrectly. Surprisingly, I said, well, do you miss Hannah? Do you wish Hannah would come home with you? She said, no, Hannah's at work and Hieji is everywhere else. And that was interesting too. But this idea of selling a brand and living inside a brand, like whether it's Flower Power or Failing Fast, I encountered that so often in the reporting we do in Rough Translation. And I think it is important to realize, I mean, it's the other side of a global culture where whether you're Portugal, as we mentioned before, trying to attract digital nomads as a part of a survival strategy post-austerity, or whether you're, frankly, I saw this a lot in East Africa, a kind of appeal for aid. And sometimes it's a negative brand because a negative brand is what brings sympathy and brings the dollars. Or, I mean, I see this branding is so important in terms of what's happening in Ukraine. I mean, Russia, as you send a couple of missiles, I mean, I'm talking about in 2014 when the war was starting, and suddenly the country itself is seen as no-go to investors. So branding is absolutely something that is something countries do, and people then live inside. I suppose similar to how somebody lives inside a company's brand, but you could leave the company. Sometimes you can't just leave the country.
And in fact, it's one of the real challenges of working inside a company is when there's discrepancy between the brand and the experience.
Right.
I think a lot of Silicon Valley is going through that right now. And by the way, when I say it's a lie, it's not that it's a lie. It's spin. That's all. It's spin. And it's the spin that sometimes travels around the world. But that spin, especially right now with the layoffs in Silicon Valley and a decade of low interest rates that have led to very little of that. And then it was easier to believe the spin for a long time. And people are just very surprised by the effects of the economy on businesses.
Yeah, I think the story people tell themselves around success is something that is so important to understand the varieties of experience around that. Because when I was based in East Africa, people talked a lot about entrepreneurship. And clearly, we're looking at the next 30 years of employment. I mean, we need a lot more people around the world to be thinking entrepreneurially, to creating the jobs of the future that don't exist today. But entrepreneurship does take more than just gumption and drive and courage and a good business idea. It also, I mean, we all know this, right? It takes a fair amount of infrastructure. And so one of the things that we were exploring, in the episode you mentioned about Failing Fast, these clubs to talk about failure around the world, is that it gives people a chance to talk about failure that didn't just lead to success, that didn't lead to the next thing, that didn't fit the Silicon Valley narrative. And sometimes that had to do really with the fact that there was so much corruption or so much bureaucracy. It's not because you learned anything about yourself and the hubris of your idea. It's just your country did not align with your ambitions. And so what do you do with that? It can feel kind of depressing, but somehow these clubs are not depressing. That was something that I wanted to really emphasize, which is that they are, so people can create community even not around success stories. They can find each other in failure.
Yeah, that was an interesting episode. And it started in Mexico, as I remember. And what's so interesting about it, somebody started a club where people could come and talk about failure. And it was sort of like the Moth Radio Hour, where you could come and you could tell a story about your failure. And there was so much shame, such a tradition of shame around failure, that just to be able to admit to that shame was liberating. What was so funny is that then that person who started it out said, I'm going to franchise this around the world. I'm going to trademark it, and we're going to send it. And it became a thing. It's a business.
Yeah. Oh, it's a successful business.
He failed, and then he was like, I wonder what I can do with. It's almost like recycling. Gosh, I've got all this scrap left over from the business that failed. Maybe I can I resell the failure?
Yeah, it's called fuck up nights.
Oh, yeah, that's right. But where was it? Not every place in the world.
Right. In places which don't like the curse, they call it fun nights.
Yeah.
FU nights.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting to hear all the cultural iterations of failure. In Tokyo, admitting a mistake could kill your career, but in France, if you screw up, you can seize the day at the beach. That's a very French idea. In Toronto, you're supposed to note in these nights not just how you failed, but how your failure affected others. So yeah, the stories, the ways in which we frame and the way it feels appropriate to talk about failure are really different. But also it's interesting, like even when it is just an abysmal disaster and you were screwed by bureaucracy or by corruption, it's also about sharing tips in an information poor environment. So yeah, there seems to be a real value in this franchise.
Yeah, that's right. And the tips are quite local, which is this is the way corruption works here. Don't go down this path. This is the way taxes work here, or this is the way a corporate structure works here. Yeah, I can see that. There's one other story that you told that I'd like to bring up, and it's about the long distance truckers, the women who, for very different reasons, became long distance truckers. And one story was of a woman who was escaping an abusive relationship and became a trucker. First of all, what was interesting in those stories was that there wasn't much about government. It's maybe because we can't see the effects when it's in the United States, they're just invisible to us. But it was very much about, well, I'm going to say solitude. So these were transformational stories of people who started trucking, and because they got to sit so much time just with themselves, there were two possibilities. One is that they found self-discovery. The other is they lived in solitary confinement. So I don't know where to take that particular one. I found it moving, this idea that you could have a job, you could potentially be trapped in that job that kept you in solitary.
Yeah. I think about solitude a lot. As somebody who's worked as an international correspondent, you spend a lot of time alone in places. Sometimes you can get very lonely. And it also, let's talk about this story. It speaks to, I think, something that we can get out of this kind of journalism that we don't always think of as when we think of our mission as journalists, which is that empathy can be really invigorating. I mean, it often is framed as something like we're supposed to do because it's good for others. You know, it's like broccoli. But I mean, a lot of times just walking through somebody, listening to somebody else's story, like this one about solitude, it can be an adventure. It can feel like we're, I don't know, entering virtual reality or taking a road trip or something. And literally in this story we are. So I went into this story very selfishly thinking, wow, I am spending a ton of time away from the office and I want to know how to handle it. And long distance truckers have been dealing with solitude for a long time now. And what will they have to say about spending your workday alone? What I never expected was that they had thought so deeply about it. And maybe that's my prejudice or something. I just hadn't realized that meditating on solitude and what it can do for you and its dangers was something that people could speak so eloquently about. And yeah, So we ended up following in this story 2 long distance truckers, both women, who fell into trucking for very different reasons, but who then had gone on this journey and thinking about themselves. And they use this phrase called windshield time, which is the time you spent on the road. But also windshield time means a kind of meditative time, a kind of time spent in reflection where you're not even thinking about the route. You're not even thinking about your job. You're just in the zone and thinking, recreating stories and remembering things. And it can be a real cocoon, a real sort of moment of change for people.
It's like a monastery.
Yeah.
A silent retreat.
Yeah, absolutely. Silent retreat with car horns, right?
Right.
Yeah, it can be a real place of change.
On the topic of empathy, I know you just did a series on Ukraine. Going around the world as a journalist and exploring the world with empathy, it seems like it could be damaging. Like you could get hurt. And I say this partially because I was, for, 6 years, I was a criminal defense investigator, and I worked for the public defender's office, the alternate public defender's office. Well, there's stuff that, frankly, I had to go in and I had to study, really study, that I don't want to know, and I still know.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if that's a known hazard for journalists.
Yeah. I mean, look, I covered quite a few wars. I've lived in Afghanistan for 2 years. I covered the prolonged terror attacks in Nairobi. I was in South Sudan during that war. At one point, hid inside a large vase during a coup. These kinds of experiences.
It was a large vase.
It was very large. I was hidden.
You were lucky. Human-sized vase.
Yeah, it was amphora.
Okay.
But I guess, yes, first of all, there has been more resources really in the past decade for reporters to talk about trauma. I think it's absolutely important. There's a great, the DART Center is one of the groups that does more on this. I think journalists have to see themselves not just as toughing it out, but the secondary trauma that can happen. But I will say that a lot of times for me, I've just been struck by the fact that I can leave and I can get out. So the thing that I carry with me are the sort of stories of courage of people I've met. So I would say that, yeah, whether it's painful or whether it's affirming, I would say it leans toward, I'm just so in awe of some of the folks that I've met in different places around the world who exhibit bravery that the world will never see.
So, I asked this question, which is, what job do you hire your job to do for you?
Okay, so I was thinking about this question. I feel more comfortable in places where I don't belong. I don't know why that's true. I always thought this was a weird, embarrassing fact about me, but then I met other people that felt the same. If I'm in a room of people that just look and sound exactly like me, I get a little itchy. So I will say that journalism has been a remarkable excuse to get into places where I don't belong. I mean, the first time I went to Kabul, I didn't speak any Dari, so I showed up with my accordion, which I had learned to play accordion in Ukraine. And I figured, the universal language of music, I'll connect with people. And I played accordion for somebody and they said, how do you know Afghan music? I said, it's not Afghan music. That's a song that my mom used to sing. He said, no, it's Afghan. I got into this big argument with him. But it led me to be on the trail of the Afghan Elvis, who is this remarkable pop star who was suddenly silenced in 1979 with the takeover of the Taliban, and led to me playing Johnny Cash on stage in Mazar-e Sharif, which exists somewhere on YouTube. But the reason that was valuable to me was not just because it was an amazing adventure, but it was also just showing me this whole other side of Afghanistan at a time when all people were talking about was burqas and the Taliban and poverty. And so I felt like I had some secret knowledge of a place. Not so secret, I also put it on the radio, but I felt like I got to see around the American gaze of so much of the US media. I got to be in a story and see a different perspective on it. And that's, of course, informs rough translation. It's always what I've most loved about my job.
That's interesting. So what I'm going to say that is I hire my job to broaden my gaze.
Yes.
It's sort of a form of discovery, but it's a very specific kind. It's a fairly recent episode with Joe Pine was talking about the experience economy and how he's extended that into the transformation economy. And this idea that you can have a product that is where you, in using that product, are the output. And it sounds like one of those. It sounds like it's a transformation product for you.
Absolutely. I mean, in my mind, sometimes I'm thinking of rough translation as writing a field guide to the world. And it would be a very long field guide. It would be thousands and thousands of pages to get through it all because we spend so long on any one story. But it's because we're not just trying to compile information, but trying to kind of experience ourselves as we try to navigate other places, unfamiliar environments. I mean, I love that Joe Pine interview. He quotes, I think, Jeffrey Kotler, and talks about the transformative experience of travel. And we're not a travel show, but the value you can learn. I always feel like I'm giving nutritious sort of like homework here. Like you're supposed to learn about the rest of the world, but it never feels like that. I was reading, I think because of the Joe Pine interview, a fascinating article in the Harvard Business Review about the neuroscience of reading fiction and talking about how most people read nonfiction, but reading fiction can actually help us really develop empathy and critical thinking and understanding people. I believe strongly, I mean, ever since I heard that interview, I want to give people transformational experiences, which, help people see the world through a different perspective, but also see themselves. I think it can be incredibly disorienting, but freeing to realize that the rules you thought were governing your life are just a product of culture. So I think that we can give that travel experience to people without making them buy a plane ticket. And that's what I aspire to.
Yeah, which is one of the things that's interesting about it is that you're telling stories of transformation and you are giving transformational stories to others. Yeah. What does your job cost you?
The news is usually bad. Bad news is typically what news is. The bleeds it leads idea. People have heard that probably. And I think the danger with that is not just that we start to feel more afraid or feel that we live in a world that's scarier, but become very vulnerable. I mean, we as journalists, as storytellers, we become very vulnerable to becoming tools of manipulation. I mean, a perfect example of this is terrorism. The goal of terrorism is not to kill people. It's to create headlines and scare not dozens, but millions, scare away investment. And so it's very easy, I think, to feel like you've become a pawn of people that want to manipulate the story, and they know what the stories are. So I think pushing against that into this territory that is, sometimes I think about, I'm covering stories of ordinary lives, quiet dramas that feel so big to the person but are not headline news, are valuable. But it's hard sometimes to sell them. It takes a tremendous amount of time to interview people and to get those stories. So it's a lot easier to cover war.
And there's this flip side to it, which is you can become a tool of it, but also you can become a connoisseur of it. In other words, you start to commoditize tragedy because you're like, oh, that's a good one over there. I could really turn that into something.
I figured we'd talk about this at some point, and the cost you question is sort of the right one. So NPR is decided that they can no longer afford actually rough translation. They're stopping production on rough translation after our next season, which is in the summer.
Along with other titles, right?
Yeah, they've stopped all their.
Yeah.
There's a huge budget shortfall at NPR. They are the public radio system in general, but especially NPR is really hurting. They're at a $30 million shortfall. And so they needed to cut shows that weren't radio shows. I certainly disagree with the decision, but sometimes it's easiest to cut the hard to classify, the innovative thing. And so you stick with what a company knows. And that's certainly a conversation I've had with NPR. But what I'm so excited about is that in this period of figuring out what the future is, what's the next step, so many people who've listened to rough translation have reached out. And just in the past week since this was announced, I've been having some incredible conversations with partners and with people that I never expected. I just didn't think of at NPR. It's been really exciting. I don't know, to think about what this work what I'm doing, how it could live in different forms.
Yeah, downturns which may affect NPR. I don't know if that's the direct effect, but it's certainly affecting Silicon Valley. They're like a tilling of the soil, and things grow out of that. And some exciting things can grow out of that, which doesn't always land with the people who've just been tilled. When you say that, like, hey, there's a silver lining, but it's great because you're already in a position where you're starting to see, shoots, that are growing.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. I do a lot of interviewing of rebels and bridge builders on the show. Those are sort of our go-to characters because oftentimes those are the people who are challenging cultures in their country or their place. And it's, I think, often most interesting to hear about culture from the point of view of somebody who's at friction with that culture and is trying to interrogate it and be curious about it. And so the position of a rebel or a bridge builder and somebody who has one foot in one world, one foot in another. I can't talk too much about all the different conversations I've had. I hope to announce that soon, but it does feel like those kinds of voices are something that I'm really excited about highlighting even more strongly, and not just highlighting, but supporting. Yeah, that seems kind of vague, but certainly I hope to announce some interesting developments soon. And to the extent to which people listening to this are interested or see partnerships for them in the work I'm doing in Rough Translation, now is definitely the time to reach out.
Some friends and I talk about the legibility reaper, which is if you're illegible, and this is a term that we got from one of the other people I interviewed was Bill Hurst at Cambridge, is a political scientist, and governments need to create legibility on the workforce is the term that's used, which is I have to govern this giant group, and to do that, I need to make it comprehensible to me. And so as a part of governing this giant country, to make it legible, I'm going to classify everything. I'm going to try to put it in order and just make sense of it. And then, things are messy, so I'm going to force people into the order. And legibility is the term that's used by political scientists to describe the need to make a complex situation understandable.
Yeah.
When things get scary, the legibility reaper is the one who goes around saying, well, I don't understand that. That's the thing that can go. You talk about bridge builders. It happens to a lot of bridge builders in companies because bridge builders are harder to understand than skyscraper builders for some reason.
It's beautiful. It's well said.
So, and rebels.
And
rebels are annoying. Bridge builders are hard to understand because it's not a thing. It's an in-between the things thing. So,
one thing that struck me thinking back on the Workplace series, specifically the stories that we've talked about, is the way in which workplace culture is forged in times of crisis. Even crisis was just long past. The Portugal story that we referenced, I mean, the dictatorship fell in 1974, and people are still living with the echoes of that dictatorship in workplaces today in Portugal. A story we didn't talk about was this episode in France, but a workplace culture forged in a previous pandemic 100 years earlier still sort of creates the laws that are today. It's made me think about the way in which crisis is an opportunity for, but sometimes an opportunity that we don't quite realize for workplace culture change. In some ways, what I was hoping to do with this series is to have these conversations about places which are having crisis far away from us. We can be kind of neutral about looking at them in order to better understand the way workplace culture is forged here in the U.S.
The things are choices. I mean, that's part of it is that there are things that are choices that we didn't realize were choices that had been made. Maybe because they were forged in some event before we were born.
Yeah, I don't know. But my son just came back from his school. He's 11 years old, and he had been taught that you should not ask, where are you from? This is something he learned in school, because where are you from can be an offensive question. And I understand that, it can be a question that marks people as outsiders. But if people are being taught, kids are being taught, don't ask, where are you from? We're losing the tools, I think, to understand each other. And it feels important to have ways in which to talk about cultural difference and ways in which to be curious about each other that don't feel distancing, but are ones that actually create empathy and not create exclusion.
What do you hope for your next thing?
I don't know how much I could say about this, but I do hope that...
Well, you don't have to be specific about what the next thing is, but what you hope about.
A Yale professor asked me to put together a course on the art of interviewing.
Which, by the way, you could sell. Do you know how many podcasters there are out there who would buy a course on how to interview?
Yeah, and I think look, I mean, it's my favorite tool of the job. I think about it all the time. How do you interview people? And it seems to be, I mean, I would say a skill that's not just useful to you and I, but to anybody trying to lead a team or to manage a group of any sort or just trying to live in the world, I think an interview question can shut somebody up or it can open doors. And so understanding how to ask people questions and how to listen and how to ask follow-ups, especially in a time when we are more and more aware of no-go zones. We spend a lot of time talking about what we're not supposed to ask people about. But I think that's why it's even more important to figure out tools to be able to ask people about things and have conversations. And so, yes, I would love to do more to share tools of interviewing. I would especially love to do more to lift up local storytellers. It's something that's so important to me at Rough Translation. And I think that we do it so much domestically. We're much more aware that it's important to hear voices of different people who are experiencing things, and whether across lens of class, or race, or ethnicity. And yet, so many of the times that we talk about the rest of the world, we listen to the stories from a very narrow group of people. And I would say this has value, not just because it's good to do, it's nice to be able to be fair, but because if we are just listening to the rest of the world through this American gaze, or through people who know what we want to hear, I don't want to sound too grim, but I would say that for the next 10 years, we cannot just be listening to a kind of media landscape that is just suffused with an American point of view. It's not the way in which we're going to understand crisis. It's not the way we're going to understand the tectonic shifts. And so even from a cultural lens, love the enterprise of figuring out who are local voices who have a story to tell, but who just need some partnership in order to be able to catch the ear of Americans. And I think we'll all be better off for it.
That's beautiful. I want to thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you, Dart. It's been an absolute pleasure. Your show has been, I will say, comfort to me in this period. I look forward to listening to it and the guests you have.
When you have the course on interviewing, I'm in. I'm totally in.
Okay, I'll sign you up.
And where can people learn more about you?
So probably the best thing to do is to follow my Substack. I've just started a Substack. It's called Around the World in 85 Days. And just keep treating this as a chance for people to know what's next and where the stories are going to exist. Because when I started, I had 85 days left at NPR. So Around the World in 85 Days is to look back, but it's also look forward. Of course, if you want to just reach out to me, probably LinkedIn, which is the way you found me.
Well, thank you. Great talking to you.
Thanks, Dart.
Thanks for joining me for another episode of Work for Humans. If you enjoyed this episode, please give us a 5-star rating wherever you listen to podcasts. And share the show with one person you think would get value from it. Believe it or not, this really helps us grow the show and reach more people who want to build the kind of work that people really want. As always, thank you to my producer, Jason Ames at Ninth Path Audio, for his insights into content and his high standard for quality. Final note, the opinions shared here are my own and not the views of Google or Cisco Systems. Thanks again for listening. See you next time.